Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review, now at the fourth player here on this list. And honestly, the top three, which were Meier and Reimer and Hertl, those were kind of inarguable, I would say. The vast majority of Sharks fans would likely agree that the Sharks' three best players this season were Meier, Hertl, and Reimer. Some might put those into different positions. Some might even think that Reimer was the best player for the Sharks. Some might think that Hertl was right behind Meier, things like that. But most would agree that that was the top three. But past the top three, it gets a little more murky. Who do some people actually put in the fourth place position? There's probably a lot of arguments for a lot of different players, but personally, I have the Sharks captain, Logan Couture here, who has a very strong bounce back year compared to last season, where it was one of, if not his worst seasons, at the very least, offensively. But first, we will actually do a bit of history when it comes to Logan Couture, drafted all the way back in the 2007 entry draft, made his debut, but didn't actually sort of expire his rookie season, played 25 games in the regular season, which was just barely keeping him in the cutoff, so he was actually a rookie in the following year for the 10-11 season, was a Calder nominee, but at this time he was, of course, because he was still young and he was on a very talented San Jose Sharks team, he was still playing in the shadows of players like Thornton and Marleau and Pavelski, and even at the time, Danny Heatley, I guess you could say, and so much of the players the fans around the league and the media around the league, besides Sharks fans, didn't necessarily know Logan Couture's name all that well. And that really changed come the 15-16 season. He once again was just having a pretty solid regular year like he usually does, 60 points, maybe coming close to 70 points, but it was the playoffs where he really made a name for himself. You see, that was the year and the only year that the Sharks actually made it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and so all hockey eyes were taking a look at this particular series between the Sharks and the Pittsburgh Penguins, and those eyes managed to see Logan Couture's stat line of 30 points in 24 games, over a point per game in the playoffs, leading scorer in this particular situation, and he did so well that even though the Sharks ended up losing in 6 games to the Penguins in that Stanley Cup Finals, he was actually in the conversation for the Conn Smythe, which is awarded to the playoff MVP, and that frequently ends up being on the Stanley Cup winning squad. I believe the last time a player not on the Stanley Cup winning team actually won the Conn Smythe was all the way back in the 2003 season when it was Jean-Sébastien Giguère who won it. And so that the fact that Couture was actually in that conversation is very impressive nonetheless. Now, he had always been a player who raised his level in the playoffs. If we take a look at the 10-11 playoffs, I believe in the 18 games he played, he had 14 points. In the 12-13 playoffs, in the 11 games that the Sharks played, he had 11 points, but this was really the season he asserted himself, and from then on, people recognized Couture as a very, very good center around the league, not just offensively, but a well-rounded player, and while he wasn't necessarily a top 5 center, many would consider him closer to that top 15 spot, I would say. And then further on in the next coming seasons, he'd continue to have those 60-point, 70-point years, but in the playoffs would also raise his level, and most recently, it was the 18-19 playoffs where he had 20 points in 20 games, including 14 goals, so obviously extremely impressive. And this is something that a lot of head coaches and general managers love about their players, is when they can raise their level of play going into the postseason, because that is really the major thing that matters. But that is a bit of a double-edged sword still, because you watch Logan Couture in the playoffs and how well he plays, and then you watch him in the regular season where he does pretty well, but not insanely well, and you wonder why he can't sustain that type of level throughout the entire regular season, or at least most of the regular season, because of course, if Couture did play as he did in the regular season as he does in the playoffs, he'd easily be a point per game player, but that just never really happens. And you might say, well, like you said earlier, the playoffs is the only thing that matters, but the problem then becomes when your team doesn't actually make the playoffs, like we've seen from the San Jose Sharks the past 3 seasons, your player is kind of just not doing as well as you know he can during the regular season, which is mattering to you at this point because you're not even making it to the postseason. And so, like I said, this past year was an extremely down year the season prior to this one was an extremely down year for Logan Couture, his worst offensive output season of his entire career, right down there. And the big issue for that was that Couture is not a young player anymore. When it's a 23-year-old, 24-year-old player and they have a down season, their worst of their entire short career, you're expecting a bounce back to actually happen like we saw from Timo Meier this season. But when your player is now over the age of 30, where most players begin their decline, when you see that season that really sticks out as their worst season ever, you're not necessarily expecting that bounce back, and you're kind of worried that that could become the new norm for that particular player. And so coming into this season, it was a massive question mark for Logan Couture, and considering the Sharks offensively did not necessarily get better, and you could argue got worse with the departure of Evander Kane, it was definitely a very real possibility that Couture would not perform necessarily all that well, but luckily that didn't end up being the case. 77 games played for Couture, 23 goals, 33 assists for 56 points. A pretty solid season, not exactly back to the level that he was back in his heyday and back in the San Jose Sharks heyday, but still a very impressive performance on a team that was offensively inept when Logan Couture also was not really given all that much help. We saw primarily Meier was obviously leading the way, fantastic year for him, but when it comes to a player like Tomas Hertl would pretty frequently find himself playing with a player like Timo Meier, which really helps out. When it comes to Logan Couture, his most common lineup situation at even strength was playing with both Meier and Dahlin. Obviously, Meier is very good, Dahlin not necessarily that great, but that was only for 25% of his even strength ice time. Pretty much the next four most common lineup combinations feature Couture with players like Bonino, Gregor, Nieto, Chmelevski. These are not necessarily the most offensively fantastic wingers that Logan Couture could be paired with. These are players that if you were to look on like the powerhouse teams like Colorado and Tampa Bay, that would barely even be fourth liners in those particular position. And yet the San Jose Sharks were playing many of them on the second line with Logan Couture. So it's kind of hard to blame Couture for maybe not putting up that many points when his line mates were frequently players who much more belonged in the Sharks' bottom six, but they didn't really have the luxury to actually play them there. And so it is definitely more forgivable. When it comes to Logan Couture's plus minus, it is a bit of a difficult to look at number of minus 11, which is a decent bit worse than players like Hertl and Meier, but it should also be noted that when it comes to the toughest matchups for the San Jose Sharks, when you're going up against the players like McDavid and McKinnon, you're not necessarily sending on the Timo Meier line to defend against them because Meier's not necessarily all that great defensively. But you are sending on the Logan Couture line, and so since your team is generally losing games, you're going to end up accumulating a few more minuses than the other teammates who aren't necessarily getting those tough matchups, so it's not a huge surprise. Another stat we can take a look at to sort of paint Couture in a bit of a better position would be his shot attempts percentage, which relative to the rest of his teammates is actually rather solid as he makes his way in around the top 5 or top 6 behind players like, of course, Meier and Hertl. And when you consider his offensive zone time starting percentages, which is, his percentage of faceoffs that he starts in the defensive zone, it's actually still looking pretty good. So generally, he still showed himself to be a rather solid 200-foot player. On top of that, his time on ice shows that Bob Booner still relies on him pretty consistently, 18 minutes and 56 seconds. The major thing that you could note here is that his even strength ice time did take a bit of a hit. It seemed as though that Booner was more so looking towards the Timo Meier line compared to the Logan Couture line, which again is not that much of a surprise considering the Meier line features Hertl and Barabanov, at least near the end of the season, while the Couture line featured players like Chmelevski and Nick Bonino. But one thing that Couture's ice time isn't suffering in is the shorthanded ice time, which once again Couture led the way in terms of forwards. He is still the guy that with backs against the walls in a penalty killing situation that Bob Booner looks towards to actually keep the San Jose Sharks alive and keep the puck out of the net when it comes to any 5-on-3 situation. As long as Couture isn't literally sitting in the penalty box for said penalty, he is the guy that they still turn towards. And so he is still clearly relied upon on this team and still doing a very good job, or at least a pretty good job. We don't really know exactly what goes on off the ice as captain for this team. And so in terms of a grade, Logan Couture, a vast improvement from last season. He gets the grade of a B. Class dismissed.